All right, today there is a war happening right now that affects everyone's wallet in America than any election ever could. And it is the war between the White House versus the Federal Reserve. Now, we are taught that the Fed is independent, keep politics out of our money, which in theory, if we're going to have a central bank, is what we want. But as you're about to see, that independence now is an illusion. The government doesn't want an independent bank anymore. They want a printer that says yes. And if they get full control, which is what they're planning on doing now, the inflation we saw last year is going to be very mild compared to what we're going to experience. So let's break this down exactly how this game is rigged against you. So let's move on to this video. All right.
We do not need the Federal Reserve or any other central bank for that matter, and without them, the world would be a much better place. However, a central bank controlled by the central government is far worse than a central bank that can operate under any semblance of independence. And unfortunately, based on both the patterns of history and the things happening right now with the Federal Reserve under attack by the executive branch, it seems like we are headed to a place where the Federal Reserve will be much more influenced or either outright controlled by the executive branch. Now, the reality is we do not need the Federal Reserve because the few functions that they do perform could be taken care of far better by the free market. In other words, we don't need to replace the Federal Reserve with anything. We need to just get rid of it. The Federal Reserve takes care of two main categories: regulating banks and setting monetary policy. We'll talk about regulating banks in just a moment. First, let's talk about monetary policy. Monetary policy comes down to a couple of things, basically to influence the money supply. They add or subtract from their balance sheet, which is printing money or withdrawing liquidity from the economy, and they set interest rates. Specifically, they set the federal funds rate, and that is the rate that banks can lend and borrow from each other overnight. Now, because of this interest rate being set by the Federal Reserve, it has an influence over all other interest rates in the economy. Even though they're not outright controlling those other interest rates, they do influence it by controlling the one Fed funds rate. And because they are setting the federal funds rate at a specific interest rate, it means that interest rate is always wrong.
Now let that sink in. The interest rate is always wrong because technically the free market isn't able to do what's called price discovery for the value trade, as I explained in my course. When you give money, you expect value. So a value, because value is derived from the beholder, everyone's value system changes. This is why there's price discovery. In general, everyone believes a McDonald's burger is worth about $6. That's in general. Some people are willing to pay $15, as some people are doing, but most people say that's too expensive and it drops the price. So the problem is that entire thing that goes on, essentially that system to find prices, isn't allowed to happen when it comes to the US dollar. Just like a price of a house or a car. But because the Fed fixes the price, imagine if a board of 12 people decide the price of bread for the entire country every 6 weeks. Sometimes it would be too cheap and you have a shortage. Sometimes it would be too expensive and it would rot on your shelves or something like that. But that is exactly what they do with money. They manipulate it, the cost of debt, to encourage you to spend or to suffer. It's not just economics at this point, it's social engineering.
In other words, it is different than what the free market would have it otherwise, without the Fed's influence. Now you might say, well, the Federal Reserve targets sometimes and can sometimes hit a neutral interest rate. And that is incorrect for two reasons. Number one, it gets rid of the entire reason for the Fed's existence in the first place, or at least their intervention with interest rates. Because if the Fed really wanted the interest rate to be the neutral rate or the interest rate to be where the free market would have it, they just wouldn't control it. And then it would be free floating, and then it would be whatever the free market would set it at. The very fact that they do choose an interest rate is specifically because they are trying to set it at a place that is different than where the free market would have it. For example, when I go to borrow money, the lender, usually the bank, is going to look at my income history, my current amount of debt, my debt history. Have I ever not paid back debt before? Have I ever borrowed in a similar amount that I'm trying to borrow right now? Have I borrowed a lot of debt in the past? Have I borrowed very little? They're going to take into account many factors to determine, are they going to loan me money? How much money are they going to loan me? And when they do decide to loan me money, how much are they going to charge me? What is the interest rate? And my interest rate will be different than somebody else's interest rate, even if they're buying the same thing, even if they're borrowing the same amount, because they have different conditions. And that is how all interest rates should operate. But because the Federal Reserve sets interest rates or sets the Fed funds rate, it means at least that interest rate and any other rates that are influenced by it are going to be different than where the free market would have it otherwise. Which means that financial conditions will always be either too easy or too tight. Either interest rates will be higher than they would be otherwise or lower than they would be otherwise, which means there's always a misallocation of resources happening. Always incentives to perform economic activity that are different than what would be incentivized with a pure free market. So you say, okay, well, I can get behind that. Maybe interest rates should all be completely free floating and should not be set by a few unelected bureaucrats that are appointed and have no political accountability, no accountability to the voters, and they're ivory tower elites who have never worked a real job a day in their life. Okay, I can get behind that. But I can't get behind not regulating the banks, because without somebody overseeing the banks and regulating them, they could just run wild. They could take on way too much risk. They could get way too aggressive and they could fail and they could lose everybody's money. But you have to remember, if banks actually had no regulator and they actually had nobody coming in to bail them out, they would have to be concerned about risk. Today, they don't.
And I want to stop it there because that is like the crux of why even some of the conversations I've had with certain financial professionals in the world, because I still to communicate with these people, that is my biggest problem with the financial services industry, because they don't have to suffer through any of the consequences when they do things wrong. When I was a financial advisor, I would always hesitate to allow them to manage my money. Now, on one side, since everyone's doing it and the entire system is essentially built on top of this, if they go down, everything falls apart. So there is a safety in numbers in that regard. But the other end, and this is the side I really care about, is the fact that if things go wrong, you made your money on commissions already. You made your money on the leverage. You made your money managing their money. What they're paying you for, because they look at you as a financial authority. But unfortunately, because you decided to not care about risk, because it wasn't your money. If it was your money, you wouldn't be as risky as you are. But because you're dealing with other people's money, this is the problem, that they get real conceited. They feel like they're not, they won't get touched, and they're not even accountable. So because when things do go wrong, they ask for a bailout, which is what the car market is starting to do now. AI companies are asking the government to do it. Now you're incentivizing bad behavior by these corporations who not only aren't providing the real value that the customers want, we can't even vote with our wallets, by punishing them, because then our elected bureaucrats will essentially save them because they're getting essentially a cut under the table. And this is what this entire system, it goes so much deeper. I'm trying to break it down as much as I can, but that's when I say the government as an entity, that's what I mean. The entity of the government wants to always get bigger, always siphon more wealth from its people, its subjects. This is every country. And it's on us to say, no, you can't do that no more. And we're stopping it now. Let's go on. I don't want to rant a little bit, but I had to get that out.
The reason why so much regulation over banks is necessary is because there's so much subsidizing. There's so much of an implicit bailout. Because they don't have to worry about the risk, we also need regulators come in and stop them from that moral hazard. But if there were a true free market in banking, then if a bank took on too much risk, they would fail. They'd have to be worried about a bank run. There would be skin in the game. And so it is true that every single thing the Federal Reserve does could be done by the free market better, and everybody's lives would be better as a result. But the reality is we do have a Federal Reserve, and their independence is now being threatened, although their independence doesn't really look like what most people think it looks like. Many people say that the Federal Reserve is politically independent. Here's what that actually means. Back in 1977, the Federal Reserve Reform Act was passed. And you can go through and read this, but we're gonna focus on just the first page. You can see in section 2A, Congress has given explicit instructions to the Federal Reserve on what they are allowed and supposed to be doing, which means the Federal Reserve does things only because Congress has told them to do them, and it only exists because Congress allows it to exist.
Yes. So when it comes to our monetary policy, it's up to Congress, which is what, if I remember correctly, that's the legislative branch, to essentially tell the Federal Reserve what its goals, its mission statement is. This is where the separation comes in. Now, at the end of the day, they're all working together, but in the real terms, that's why a separation exists. I just wanted to pinpoint that out so we all understand, because we're taking this step by step as you go through this video, just to explain how this affects you. To me, this is politics, not what everyone talks about. To me, this is real politics. This is how political nature is used to siphon wealth away from the middle, working, and lower class to the elite class. All right, let's see.
So the Federal Reserve is not politically independent in the sense that it just does things for the overall economy. No, it exists because of and exclusively for the government. It says the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Open Market Committee shall maintain long-run growth of the monetary and credit aggregates commensurate with the economy's long-run potential to increase production. In plain English, that means we want you to expand the money supply at roughly the same pace as the economy grows. That way, the dollar doesn't really lose much purchasing power, but it definitely doesn't gain in purchasing power either. And the reason why the government doesn't want the dollar to gain in purchasing power is because that means that we have deflation. And that means that borrowers suffer. It means that if I borrow dollars today, I have to pay them back in the future with dollars that are worth more. If I'm the government and I'm borrowing billions and then trillions and trillions of dollars, I don't want that to get harder to pay off. I want it to get easier. I want to be able to borrow more and more as time goes on, not be forced to borrow less and less. So the last thing I want as a government is for the cost of living of individuals to go down. And we see that by the implementation of this overall goal. The implementation of this overall goal is through promoting the goals of maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. Maximum employment is there to ensure that the government has the maximum number of taxpayers possible. It's not about making sure everybody has jobs. In reality, an individual's goal should be wealth creation. We want financial freedom. We don't want to have to work a job our entire life until we die. We want to be able to build wealth. The government does not want people to build wealth. The government wants you to have to be employed. Maximum employment, as many people as possible for as long as possible. This allows them to extract the most possible taxes from the most possible people.
Now, let that, rewind that, everything. This is why I love this channel. I watch this guy stuff all the time. But he does a great job explaining it, and then I can explain to you why this matters. Just like he's saying. The whole purpose of the unemployment, when you hear about, well, unemployment rate needs to be low, that's why we're lowering interest rates. The entire goal is to make sure you're working a job so you can pay taxes. This is why they always fight taxes. Because ultimately, we are essentially wage slaves to the government. That's what maximum employment means to the government. It's very important to understand that. Because then it tells you what their goals are. Now, and we make the best of a terrible situation? Of course we can. This is why we're here. This is why we're being aware of what they're doing. But they don't want you to be employed just so you can, better your life. They don't want you to retire, because if you retire, you're not paying taxes no more. They want you employed because you are taxable. you are financially free, or if you're living off assets, you are much harder to control and you're harder to tax. The system is actually designed to keep you on the hamster wheel, working, earning, paying, and then dying. They don't want you wealthy. They just want you really productive.
Next one is stable prices. Now they interpret this as 2% inflation. Now stable to me means no inflation, but they say 2% inflation means stable prices. That ensures we don't dip over into deflation where debt gets harder to pay back. Stable prices means that I have to keep on working and earning more and more and more and paying more and more in taxes in order to keep up with the cost of living increases over time. It also means I have to pay more and more in taxes on the capital gains from the things that have gone up in price simply due to inflation. And then finally, it says moderate long-term interest rates. And that is the final nail in the coffin here, because really what the Federal Reserve is there for is, again, to make sure that the government gets all the money that it wants to get. Now, maximum employment and stable prices are how they get the maximum amount of money through taxation, but we also have to moderate long-term interest rates, because if interest rates get too high, the government can't borrow as much as they want to borrow. So the Federal Reserve has to make sure that those long-term interest rates stay moderate, whatever that means. So you can see here, Congress allows the Fed to exist as long as the Fed performs these functions that allow the government to get as much money as it possibly can for the longest period of time. So the Federal Reserve is not independent in the sense that its job is to serve the overall economy. Absolutely not. It does not serve the economy. It serves the government, full stop. But that's different than serving a party. That's different than serving a president. That's different than serving the executive branch of the government. And as I'm sure you've seen in the news lately, the Department of Justice has served Powell and the Federal Reserve. And the charges here are basically because of a budget overrun for a Federal Reserve building. And don't get me wrong here. I think it's pretty clear the Federal Reserve spent way too much money on renovating a simple building. This is par for the course for the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve essentially exists outside the economy. They are ivory tower elites who, most of them, have never worked a single day in their life at a real job. They are economists trained in one very specific train of thought from a few very prestigious universities. They're ideologues. They're religious zealots. They are priests serving an economic religion. And so to them, spending a few $1 billion more, who cares? We are the ones, we are the elites, we are the ones who are responsible for making the right decisions about what will affect every American. They don't go through booms and busts. They don't go through economic recessions. They don't care about profits. They don't care about losses. None of that affects them. They are the ivory tower elites looking down on the rest of us peasants.
Is why when I talk about everything I talk about, I always preface it, not left versus right, but the elites versus everyone else. Because that's really what's happening. The elites aren't accountable to anyone, so they can abuse their power as often and as much as they want to. And we pay the price for it. This is why subsidies from the government, in my opinion, is so dangerous, because once you give them subsidies, you incentivize that government, that entity, to keep getting more powerful, until now we're at a point where there are people who justifiably are relying on that stuff now, which incentivizes the government to keep growing. Well, we can't lower the government, because we lower the government, all the subsidies that protect all these people are going to change. This is why I'm such I push so much that we must take responsibility for ourselves, our personal lives, and our own communities. It shouldn't be about government anymore, but it should be about our community sticking together. And when things go wrong, we all help each other, because we all care about each other. Everyone knows each other. Why it was so insidious when they did what they did, by destroying the family, getting rid of communities, destroying manufacturing towns, all this stuff, destroying unions. We're at a point where now they can get away with taking advantage of everyone. So didn't want to go too deep, but that's a very important thing to understand, that politics in this day and age is about the elite class, not even the upper class. The upper class experience some of this too, though they have more tools to move around. But the elites are the ones who aren't accountable to anybody. And you most likely don't even know their names, but they control everything about that dollar in your wallet right now. This is why it's so important to be aware.
Again, like I said in the beginning, none of this should exist in the first place. But let's be honest, this attack from the executive branch towards the Federal Reserve is not about spending a little bit too much money. In fact, the president just called to increase the US military spending by $500 billion. Again, it's not about the money. This is about exerting control over the Federal Reserve and doing whatever they possibly can to try and get there. And if that means digging up dirt on FOMC members and finding out that they can charge them with mortgage fraud in order to get them removed from the Federal Reserve so they can be replaced with somebody who is more inclined to vote for what the president wants.
Now that, quickly, is the most scariest part about what the government as an entity is doing. It's not about Donald Trump, even though he brings up Donald Trump. Not about Trump. You can't think of the individual. You got to think of the government as an entity. That's what's scary. They are the ones who are using the executive branch to weaponize the Department of Justice against the Federal Reserve. Why? Because they want to print more money for military spending and social programs. And the Fed is hesitating. Remember, technically, it's not a part of the government. And this is one of the very few differences the United States has over all the other countries. In most countries, the government has control of the money printer. Lebanon's a great example of this. They can print as often as they want, do whatever they want, and they have the power. And when you have, it's a conflict of interest. This is why in America, they separated the branches of government the way they are, because if you give one position too much power, they end up doing this. So if the government succeeds essentially in taking full control of the Fed, the barrier is gone. They will print whatever they need to pay the debt, and they will pay for it by devaluing your dollar. And this is what's called fiscal dominance. It means your savings account, all the money you saved over your life, is the fuel for the spending addiction by inflating all your savings away. Like, big deal, but that's what it is. It's serious. And they make it their business to keep you ignorant about it. And this is why I'm talking about it, because I know how important it is. And you got to know, and you have to understand it before we can utilize this stuff, okay?
Then they will do that. And if that means trying to find budget overspend and a way that they could possibly maybe get Powell removed, then they're going to do that. And the truth about this is that it doesn't actually matter what the results are. It doesn't matter whether the Fed or Powell is found guilty, because the stage is set now. If you don't fall in line, the administration will do anything they possibly can to try and take you down, which means anybody at the Federal Reserve, currently or in the future, will at least partially in the back of their mind be thinking, man, I wonder if those skeletons in my closet will be found. Maybe I should just fall in line so that I don't stand out as a target. And that's what this is about. It's about trying to make sure that the Federal Reserve does what the executive branch wants, instead of just focusing on the long term of what Congress told them to do. And I think it's clear. The Federal Reserve has been bad for the country. The Federal Reserve has been bad for individuals. The Federal Reserve has caused inflation, erosion of wealth, the erosion of the middle class, a massive increase in wealth inequality, and a host of other problems. But if you think that that will not get worse by being outright controlled by whoever is in power for 4 years at a time, and you're delusional. Now, this is not the first time in history that we've seen tighter coordination, let's call it, between the executive branch and the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve performed yield curve control in the United States from 1942 through 1951. This was in order to help the US government deleverage and reduce its debt load relative to the size of the economy. And just for reference, that happened the last time the government's debt to GDP ratio hit 120% from World War II. We're there again. So it's no surprise that they're pulling out the same playbook as last time. As the saying goes, history doesn't repeat, but it sure does rhyme. Which means that the next years and potentially decades are not going to look like the last couple. Times are different now. We're in a new phase of the long-term debt cycle that will look a lot more similar to the 40s through the 80s instead of the 80s through 2020. It means higher prices of goods and services and assets, higher interest rates for all of us, while the government borrows below the rate of inflation, helped out by the Fed and the printing. And if you want to know exactly how I'm playing it, how I've been playing it for the past 5 years, so I can achieve returns that are high enough to where I'm still
well, that's basically it. I mean, he goes into his course, which not a problem. Like, love it, but ultimately, that's what it is. That's why it's so important. The mask is off at this point. The Federal Reserve exists to serve the government debt, not your prosperity. So the government is currently trying to remove the last guardrail they have so they can print into infinity. And you can't stop them, but you can step out of the blast zone. And you do that by owning assets that inflate with the money supply. This is why when I talk about finance on this channel, I constantly always bring up how inflation is the expansion of the money supply. And as a result of the money supply going up, the money supply losing value, prices go up as a consequence. You can't trust a stable prices mandate because now the United States government is in too much debt. So the only way they can get away from it is to print it away, which means, and that's not even including the spending, they're still going to be spending. So at $36 trillion, if we print it $36 trillion right now, all as Harris Financial mentioned, all your goods, everything is going up in price. Insurance, everything you can think of. When you use that dollar as an exchange of value, everything's going up in price comparatively to anything else. The problem is, the United States is the only country that's going through this. Other countries are going through this too. And this is where the blast zone comes in. This blast zone is massive. I'm even going to experience it. I'm experiencing it now. We're experiencing it through higher prices. But that's why owning assets, getting a 6 months savings fund, that's all the cash you need because it provides what you need right now for the 6 months or a year. And every other dollar after that goes into purchasing assets, gold, silver, real estate, business ventures, skills, things that provide real value to you, your families, and your communities. That's what it really matters. And then once we achieve financial freedom, we can not worry about struggling so much like everyone is doing now. And we can take these guys out of power because now we see them. Now we're not desperate looking for our next job or our next paycheck because of credit card debt. Now we have the time and the attention to say, you know what? We don't want you guys up there in your elites who don't ever pay anything. Now we're going to go after you instead. Essentially, is what I'm trying to say. But anyway, hopefully you learned something today. Hopefully you came away with some new news that these mainstream media and everyone else ain't going to tell you. So thank you. Please like and subscribe if you enjoy this content.